Hello, I'm John Powell. Today's oral history is with David Helbach, who is a former majority leader and minority leader of the Wisconsin State Senate, among other things. Yeah. And thank you very much for joining us. We'll be getting to that question, the difference between being the majority and the minority leader, which I guess is the difference between black and white.
Yeah, kind of.
But first of all, how did you get started in politics? Why politics?
Well, it was kind of I don't say haphazard, but it was just kind of part of my personal life, I guess. I went to Pacelli High School in Stevens Point. It was a Christian Brothers school, at that time all boys, and you know, they were very active, and I got very active in high school. Ironically, the only election I ever lost was in high school. I ran for student council treasurer against a gentleman named Dave Labricki, which is neither here nor there, but he beat me in that race. And then when I was in college, I went to UW Stevens Point, and I was politically active, as many people my age were. There was the war going on, there was a civil rights movement, and we just kind of got right into all of that. And then a friend of mine ran for district attorney, and then he ran for the state senate. And when he ran for the state senate in 1972, I helped him in his campaign. It was a gentleman named Bill Bablich, who then became the state senator and later Supreme Court justice. And Bill got me involved in politics. And during that era, I don't know if it's as true today, but there were many of us who kind of went into politics right away rather than into the private sector, then into politics. Many of my generation went into politics first and then went into the private sector. And at that time, there were many of us. My whole freshman class was kind of that way. And then in 1973, Bill asked me, he won the state senate race, and asked me to come to Madison. And I worked on his staff for 5 years. In 1978, a special election, or not a special election, but the incumbent in Stevens Point decided to quit the assembly. Leonard Groshek was his name. And I immediately said, you know, if I'm going to continue to be in politics, I want to be in a place where I can make a difference. And so I ran for the assembly in a very interesting race where Lee Dreyfus from the same town was running for governor and ran in a primary and a general. So that's how I got involved in politics. And as I've often told my kids and others, I said, you know, I'm one of those people that you know, you want to make a difference in what you're doing. I mean, whether it's in the city council or the school board or whatever, and I wanted to do something to make a difference at the time, and I thought running for the assembly was the best way to do it.
Stevens Point then, and I guess now, is more or less Democratic territory, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a little less Democratic. At that time, it was very Democratic, so the Democratic primary was very, very important. I ran in the Democratic primary in 1978 against actually a friend of my dad's, and he had good name recognition. I guess the Helbach name was pretty good, thanks to my father and my mother's reputations. Ran against him, ran a campaign, a very sophisticated campaign for those days. Probably not for now, but for those days it was very voter ID. We identified 6,000 people and we mailed them a lot, knocked on their doors. We had lots and lots of volunteers that would do address envelopes and things, and we won that primary. I might add that in the general election, Lee Dreyfus did take Portage County, then running for Republican as governor, took Portage County with 59%, and I took the county with 59% as well. So it was kind of a unique thing, and a lot of our friends were kind of, when I went to college at UW Stevens Point, Lee started our department and all of those kind of things. So we had a lot of mutual friends. But Mel Laird, if you remember, well, it is a Democratic area, but Republicans have taken it in the past.
So there obviously is a lot of crossover voting in Wisconsin. If Dreyfus got 59% and you got 59%.
Yeah. Well, that was back in the days when people that were running weren't necessarily from the extremes, so people would, as I said, in Portage County, which is known, especially for presidential elections, is known as a Democratic area. Portage County had a very independent streak. Mel Laird, who was from Marshfield, always took Portage County when he was there.
Congressman at the time.
Congressman at the time, took Portage County.
Later Secretary of Defense under Nixon.
Right, and then Dave Obey took his place, and one of my former colleagues actually ran against Dave Obey and did very well in Portage County as well at that time, Walter John Chilson. And so there was a lot of independence at the time, although it was a staunchly Democratic. But later on, when I ran for the Senate, I ran in a more competitive district.
Did you take courses from Lee Dreyfus?
I had one course with Lee Dreyfus. We had at UW-Stevens Point the communications department. And if you know Lee's history, Lee was in communications, a professor here at UW-Madison.
He was my advisor for a time.
Oh.
I should disclaim that.
Okay, yeah.
When I was briefly in grad school in Com Arts, just before he went to Stevens Point, he was my advisor here at Madison. So.
Well, he came to Stevens Point, you know, in 1970 or so, or 1967, 68. And I remember to this day there was a little bar that my uncle started years ago called Little Joe's on the east side, in Park Ridge, right on the east side of Stevens Point. And he got up on the bar, Lee Dreyfus got up on the bar and said, "I'm LSD and I'm here to take a trip with you." We knew we had a different chancellor.
Lee Sherman Dreyfus, LSD.
Yeah. So Lee then started the communication. He was chancellor, and they started the communications department, and he taught one course a year, and I just took one course with him. But he used to raise us money. When I was in college at UW-Stevens Point, and he used to raise us money to do public service announcements. And I used to help produce and direct little 30-second public service commercials for TVs at the days when we were begging more people to come to college rather than, you know, now I guess we don't have a problem getting enough people to go to college. But so we used to make the 30-second commercials, and Lee is the one that was behind all of that.
Was that on campus? Or
on campus. We did it right in the communication, little 16-millimeter film, and we would do we'd do the commercials, and they were public service announcements, so we'd send them out to all the TV stations around the state. And Lee was the first to do that, and then other campuses followed suit after a while.
Did the stations play them?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, and we did radio spots too at that time.
So in '78, you decided to run. Did Dreyfus influence you?
No, not at all. And if anybody would, no. When I decided to run, I believe it was like in February or January of 1978. I was a staff person, as I said. I resigned from that staff position and ran full-time. Lee didn't announce until later that year. If you remember, he went to the convention, the Republican convention, lost the nomination there, and then ran in the open primary and beat, I believe, Caston.
Yeah, Bob Caston.
Bob Caston, yeah. And no, but Lee and I talked often, and Lee had campaign people that Bill Krause, if you remember, and Bob Williams.
Both from Stevens
And when
Point
I was
at the time.
running, we'd always meet about every Tuesday or Thursday night after we shut the doors on our campaign headquarters or our campaigns, and we'd meet at a place called Pete's Silver Coach in Park Ridge, and we would sit and talk, and they would talk about their Republican campaign, I'd talk about mine, and a little bit about the Martin Schreiber campaign, although I wasn't involved in it.
Could that happen today?
I don't know. You know, the days when I was in the legislature are so different, and I don't want to sound like an old guy or something and giving other people advice, but it's so different today than it was then. You know, when I went to, when I was staff, and then when I was also in the Assembly and then in the Senate, there were people on both sides of the aisle that I called very good friends. I lived in Stevens Point, and when I was in the Assembly, even when I was staff, at times I would drive down to Madison with Tiny Krieger and Walter John Chilson. We would drive together. Walter John would get on the floor, and if you remember Senator Chilson, he had the knack for a good line, you know, and he would talk about the Democrats behind closed doors in their caucus, and then we'd go out and have a drink, and we would talk, and we would resolve issues. I don't see that today, and but I could just name dozens of different Republicans that I considered really good friends that cared that government worked. And I think that was the big difference. I mean, they ran because they wanted to see government work, not because they necessarily wanted their own agendas or they wanted to cut government down. And so, but I had a lot of good friends like that. I don't know. And Lee Dreyfus, I remember he became governor then, and you know, we could talk all the time. Of course, Tommy Thompson was that way too. It's just different today.
Now, that must have been an education for you. We've done an oral history with Walter John Chilson, which is on file with us here, but unfortunately Tiny Krieger died some time ago. I wish we could do him. But that must have been some education for you, riding with them.
You know, Tiny Krieger, which is another whole history, and Walter John. You know, back in about 1948, the year I was born, in 1948 there was a huge split in the Republican Party between the progressives and the Republicans. There was a huge split. The Pat Lucys, the Gaylord, well, not Pat Lucy, but the Gaylord Nelsons became Democrats. A lot of the others became Republicans from the Progressive Party. And Tiny Krieger was an old progressive who then decided to, you know, there was that split, and he decided to stay with the Republicans. And he was in the Senate for the longest time. He was just, you know, not only a gentleman, but he had the history. And we used to go out. I mean, I don't think today you see legislators, even from the same parties, much less, you know, the Democrats and Republicans. We used to go out and have dinner. And we would go out to all hours of the night. So you would have Senator Bidwell from
Portage.
You'd have Tiny Krieger. You'd have all these other people, and Tim Cullen and Bill Bablich. You would have us all together having dinner, and we would talk about our families, but also about legislation, and we would have a good time, and we developed relationships. I don't see that happening today as much. I often think about that even within the parties, there are people that are mad at other members of the party, you know. So I don't see that as much. But those are great days. As far, I mean, for a kid that was at that time 20. When I ran for the assembly. Well, when I first started in government, I was what, 24 years old, 23, and then I ran for the assembly at 28, and you know, hanging out with a Gaylord Nelson or a Dave Obey and a Bidwell and a Tiny Krieger and all of those people, or even Ward Knowles, who would come around once in a while. And those were heady days for me when I was very young.
We should Clifford Krieger was his real name, universally known as Tiny, because he was a very large man. Had been a fat boy in the circus.
That's right. Yeah, and he had his own seat,
his own huge chair in the state senate. But that
and he's such a gentleman. He was just a great gentleman. And him and Walter John Chilson were very, just because of their age. I don't know. Walter John Chilson had such a history himself. He was in the war, and in World War II, I think he was a navigator or something like that, and actually had people in his plane die. And talking to these guys, and then they're not only the politics, but just life in general, was very interesting.
So then you got a chance to run for the Senate later.
From 78 through 83, I was in the Assembly. I was on the Joint Finance Committee, which was a real learning experience for any legislator. Joint Finance Committee just takes care of every nut and bolt in state government. So I got to know government very well. I kind of concentrated on education, school aid formulas, and those kind of things. And then I ran for re-election. The senator who I worked for, Bill Bablich, then decided to run for the Supreme Court. And so we had a special election on August 2nd, I believe, of 1983. And I ran in the Senate district, which at that time was Portage County, Wood County, a little bit of Waupaca County. And it was a special election where it was, you never knew what would happen because it was August. And I won that race, and then I stayed in the Senate until 1995.
That's very unusual to have a summer election. As we sit here, we're planning on one right now. The recall election will be June 5th, I believe.
Yeah. Well, this one was for political reasons, because the Republicans were arguing, at that time they were arguing that we were going to delay that election for all sorts of political reasons, and we says, well, and I told then Governor Earl, I said, let's just call it as soon as we can. And as you know, a Supreme Court justice takes office on August 1st. And so we had the election right away on August 2nd. It would have been in our interest to wait till a regular election rather than August 2nd. But we did that because Republicans were arguing that we were trying to delay it, so we went ahead and did it.
What was the turnout?
Turnout was, in Portage County, the turnout was great. In Wood County, which after that I took very well, I always would take Wood County. I actually lost Wood County, which is about a little less than 2/3 of the district, and I lost it. But there were enough votes in Portage County, because we concentrated on getting votes out, there were enough votes cast in Portage County that I could have gotten 0 in Wood County. So I had enough votes in 1/3 of the district that I could have not gotten any in the other part of the district. The turnout, I think, was like 15% or something. It was very, very small. It was a very scary time to run for office.
So, but you apparently did a better job of getting your vote out than the other side.
Yeah,
Who was your opponent?
I was good at that.
Who was your opponent?
The first time it was Shirley Gibbs. Shirley Gibb was a school teacher, and she, well, she was from the Assembly, Shirley Gibb was. She actually had a song, Shirley, Shirley, Shirley. I won't sing that, though. And, but I still know it today. It was a gentleman, I forget his name. He was from, Roger Cross. And Roger Cross, if you remember later, under the Thompson administration, became a head of DMV. And he was from Wapaka. Actually, I had a part of Wapaka. So Roger Cross ran it. And he won Portage County, and I took he won Wood County, and I ran and won in Portage.
Was it a three-way race then?
No, it was a two-way race. It was Roger Cross. Shirley Gibb ran against me in the Assembly when I first ran.
Okay.
It was Roger Cross.
So
some things you just forget in life, you know, like who you ran against.
Yeah. Well,
I had a lot of opponents in my time.
Well, now you probably didn't have too much of a surprise coming into the legislature since you'd worked here for 5 years.
Yeah.
What did you learn during your time working as a staffer?
Well, when you worked as a staff, and you know, you learned a lot. I mean, you learned, for instance, how to work with the legislative bureaus, the Legislative Reference Bureau and others. I had some good mentors at that time when I was staff. I had Dale Catnaugh, who was the head of the Fiscal Bureau, later the Audit Bureau, Bob Lang. And so I knew, by the time I got into the legislature, I not only knew all the processes that you have to go through in order to pass something or put a budget together, but I knew a lot of the different formulas. If you remember in the early 70s, when Pat Lucy, the Assembly turned in 1970, a huge turnover in the Assembly. They ended up with 2/3 majority. And Pat Lucy then was a very aggressive, innovative governor, great governor. And he decided at that time that we had all these different formulas about how we took all the money and then dished it out to local governments. And he completely redid the shared savings program. In the past, shared savings used to go back to where it was raised. And so if you were a rich community and a lot of income tax came from there, the shared savings, not the shared savings,
shared revenue?
Shared revenue would go back to those communities, to the richest communities. Same for schools. And he came up with the new school equalization formula back in, and that was before I got there. In that first term, his first term, that first 2-year term, first 2 years of his term. And he completely redid all those formulas. Well, as being a staff person, I became very familiar with all of those. And so when I got on the Finance Committee in '78, I knew that. When I got in the Senate, I became very much of, I guess nowadays you would call more of a wonk than someone that gives a lot of speeches. And so that was very helpful to me. And it was very helpful, just to be candid, the politics of it all. I mean, I knew how to win a seat, and I knew how to hold on to a seat.
Well, now even then it was an issue, and still is. Some people will say you've got to have real-world experience before you go into the legislature or politics, because otherwise you're just, an insider? You don't know how the real world works? True? Or?
There's a lot to that. Back in the early 70s, a lot of us in both political parties, I mean, you look at Susan Engelleiter, remember Susan, the state senator Susan Engelleiter, Mary Panzer, there's a whole mess of us who just went into politics first and then did private sector things later. There's a lot to say about having private sector experience before you run for public office, and I'll be the first to admit that. But I enjoyed it. I learned a lot about government, and then I learned a lot about private sector later. And I think I still represent it. I mean, you can learn a lot of those things, but having first-hand experience, it wouldn't have been a bad idea.
On the other hand, of course, if you've spent all your time in the private sector, you don't know how government works. You were in office, and then you arrive in Madison or Washington, and
well, I look at some of the new people in Washington, and I say to myself, well, you know, they know a lot about how to balance a private sector budget, but they don't know much about government itself. So.
What is the difference? But we should specify later on you became the, with Alliant Energy, Public Affairs Director.
Right.
With the private sector. How do they differ? I mean, we hear the old cliche, well, you got to run government like a business.
Well, just from a personal note, I mean, when I went into the private sector, Alliant Energy, I had one boss, and I had a boss, and he had a boss, and that was it. And you made decisions accordingly. And sometimes you have the board of directors to deal with as well. In the public sector, I mean, so if my boss wanted me to cut 15 staff, it was a done deal. We would cut 15 staff. Or if we were going to reinvest in something, we would do that. In the public sector, you got to garner that kind of support. I mean, you have to get your constituency there. You have to get, in the Senate, you got to get 16 other people to agree with you in order to do it. It's a whole, I mean, democracy is a very cumbersome process compared to a boardroom. But you have to learn that. So the difference was it's much easier, much quicker to make decisions in the private sector often than in the public sector because of the different constituencies. I mean, when I was in Alliant Energy, we had different constituencies. We had generation, we had the power lines, and we had the foundation, and all of those. But those were very manageable. In the public sector, you have so many different constituencies. So many different demands on that money and on the things that you want to do. So it would have been a good experience to have a little more. I did have some private sector experience. I worked for United Parcel Service and in Shopko back in the early 70s, but that it wasn't a career type thing.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing that it's so hard to get government to do something?
Well, it depends what side you are on.
Yeah,
on
whether you want it done or
yeah.
not, I suppose.
Well,
but,
nowadays, at the federal level, I'd like them to hurry up. At the state level, I'd like them to slow down a little bit. So I think it's the side you're on. The problem that I have, and it's just me complaining. I mean, I've been out of politics for a long time now, but the problem that I have with the political process today is that the rhetoric is so much different than the reality. I mean, it's let's cut, let's do this, let's do that. But then at the federal level, they can't even, they can't. I don't. Balancing the budget's one issue, but I mean, they can't even come up with an agreement on a. I mean, they want to keep student loans, today at 3.4%, and they can't even agree yet on how to do that. I mean, it's peanuts. So the rhetoric is so much different than the reality. Government was made. I mean, if you listen to Thomas Jefferson and those people, government was made to try to represent people, to slow down. Government is something that shouldn't be running roughshod on anything, and you shouldn't be passing things at 3 o'clock in the morning, which we often did. It should slow down, but it shouldn't come to a standstill at times. And that's more a federal issue. In the state, just remember that, I mean, for those who complain about the federal government in 2012, that they can't get anything done, those are some of the same people that are complaining that in Wisconsin they got too much done.
Well, because one party controls both houses and the governorship. Now, you've seen both of those situations. You were majority leader, and then you lost control and became minority leader. The difference?
Well, in fact, I was also co-leader. If you remember, Senator Mike Ellis and I were co-leaders because we had equal members at the time, and we were co-leaders for a time. So I was majority leader, co-leader, and minority leader.
Was there a vacancy then?
There was a vacancy. We had 3 special elections. If you remember back in, I believe, 1994 or so, Russ Feingold ran for the U.S. Senate and won. He was just one of my colleagues. Tom Barrett ran for Congress and won. And Senator Marv Rochelle from Chippewa Falls, was appointed by Governor Thompson to an appointment. So we had 3 special elections at that time. And because of that, I forget all the math, but we came up with, it was evenly divided. And we had the 3 special elections. We lost 2 of them and won 1. The Democrats did, and then I became the minority leader. So there's a big difference between minority leader and majority leader.
So you devolved slowly, though. You had an interim stage there.
We had like 3 months in between.
So the difference is apparently stark.
Well, the big difference is that when you're in the majority, and remember that when I was there from 1978 through the early 90s, the Democrats controlled everything. I mean, we had both houses of the legislature. And when we had Governor Thompson there, we actually worked with him a little bit. So it was, the big thing about being in the majority, or being governor for that matter, is that you set the agenda. I mean, you can set the agenda. You can decide what you're going to vote on. And then you also have, and many times, have the votes to get it done. And so you can use, in Wisconsin, the whole issue of collective bargaining. The Republicans were in control. They set the agenda, and they had the votes to get it done. In the minority, the best you can do is try to slow things down or to articulate an alternative position. And that gets very hard because in my case, when we became minority leader, I wasn't you know, you wouldn't call me a rabble-rouser or someone who would get up on and make extreme statements, whether to the press or on the floor. When you're a minority leader, you sometimes have to use a lot more political rhetoric and be a little more extreme in your positions in order to make yourself heard. And so I always had a problem with that. But setting the agenda is, in any body is the important thing, and then having the votes to get it done.
Now, you retired shortly after you became minority leader?
Very shortly.
Was that part of the reason?
Well, first I quit as I became minority leader, and then shortly thereafter I stepped down as minority leader for a lot of just personal reasons. It wasn't the kind of position I wanted. I didn't want to necessarily stake out positions. I wanted to try to get things done. And then after 18 years in the legislature, I just thought it was time to leave. So then I retired. When I didn't retire, I resigned from the Senate, and I didn't retire until later from the private sector, and then went back to the state back in '07 for a couple of years.
So, well, let's talk about that. You later, when you went back to the public sector under Governor Doyle,
Yeah.
you became the building commission secretary and the director of the Division of Facilities.
Right.
Now, long before that, as a legislator, of course, you worked on building programs as well.
Yeah.
So you've seen the state building programs for a long time.
Yeah, we have the State Building Commission has about a $2 billion budget. We managed, on top of that, as director of the, we call him administrator of the Division of State Facilities, we managed about 3.5 million square feet of property, most of the property in downtown Madison, the state office buildings around the state. We managed all of those.
But not the universities, you know?
Well, we didn't manage the university, but no, we did not manage the universities, but we did manage the building programs. And so any money over $250,000 had to go through the State Building Commission. And so if the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point wants to build a new building, it has to come through the Division of State Facilities, then my office as secretary of the Building Commission, and through the Building Commission, and then through the full legislature. And so we had the building program, but we didn't sweep the floors. We swept the floors in the other 3.5 million square feet.
Well, that sounds like a very demanding job, all of those buildings.
It was a great job. It was one of the better jobs I ever had in my life. The whole idea of setting priorities for $2 billion of building funds for all of the state facilities, plus we had about 300, 400 people, and managing the state facilities was a great job. And I worked with a lot of great people.
Sounds like a tough thing to do, though, to manage all those different kinds of things.
No, but when I was I spent 15 years at Alliant Energy, or 14 years at Alliant Energy, and I managed just almost as many people at times. So that wasn't the issue. For me, it was a great time to take because I'm a pretty good administrator, and to take my administrative skills and my management skills along with the public policy was just almost an ideal fit for me.
So does the state have too many buildings? I mean,
no.
This would seem to decry the idea that the state government can't get anything done, because we certainly seem to build a lot of buildings.
Well, you have two problems. First of all, you have a bias in state government, mainly from elected officials and from university officials, to build new buildings rather than renovate old buildings. And so you have that problem. So we are now getting into a point, especially with the university system, that we are building buildings without an operating budget to take care of them. and so you're getting more and more of that. We have a huge backlog of maintenance on our facilities in the state government, and we were successful during my tenure to increase the budget, not increase it, but to appropriate some $50 million, and Governor Doyle went along with that, $50 million for energy efficiency. So we're trying to get more energy efficiency in all of the buildings. So we are not maintaining the buildings we have, and we have a bias towards building brand new ones without providing the operational cost.
So, well, we hear this is a nationwide problem with highways and sewage systems and everything, deferred maintenance, that there's trillions of dollars worth out there. So the state buildings are in the same boat?
Well, if you take a look at the state buildings, the older buildings are in pretty bad shape and are probably getting worse. We're not keeping up to it. Remember, when you build a state building, for every dollar that you spend on that building, 10 cents goes for building it. 90 cents goes for operating it. And so they're providing the 10 cents, but they're not necessarily providing the money to operate some of those buildings. The university has had to make a lot of adjustments in order to try to make sure that their buildings are maintained, the new ones.
Well, let me ask you about the 1960s, 70s era buildings that people now want to tear down. I mean, Bascom Hall's 150 years old, and it's still in use and still sound, apparently.
Yeah, I used to call those, the 60s was the Eastern Bloc buildings that we used to do. You'd see them in Eastern Europe. The buildings of the 60s, mainly in universities, because they were poorly designed, they were poorly put together, there were energy sieves, and in many cases, although we're remodeling some of them, in many cases it's better just to tear them down and do new ones. They were, I forget the figures, but in the 60s they had to build so many buildings so fast because the student populations went up. It was just, those are just a lot of terrible buildings. And the university at Oshkosh actually took one of the older ones and renovated it and did a really good job on it. And we've done that on several other campuses, but it's very difficult to do that with these old buildings. So for instance, the ceilings are too short. And so you can't go in there and put new ventilation and HVAC systems in. So you almost have to tear some of them down. And some of them they're energy sieves. I mean, if you went through them, they just suck up energy.
Well, here in Madison, people may be familiar with the fact that the Union South has been torn down and replaced at a cost of $95 million from student funds. Now, there's part of the problem with the maintenance, right? The cost.
Right, and I'm not at the state facilities anymore, and I don't want to give the university advice, but it's one of those, that building, now that I'm retired, I like to keep friends, but that's one of those situations where we see all around the university system where the juniors and seniors of a given year vote to tax themselves $90 million, but the bill will be paid by the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. So they'll argue, well, that was voted by the student body. Well, it was voted by the student body 8 years ago, so the people that are now using it. It's a beautiful facility. The question is whether they needed that or a renovation of the current one.
Have the universities and the state built too much? Too much to handle? Do they need all the space?
It's in the eye of the beholder, I guess.
You didn't form an opinion on that?
Well, in some case, I mean, there were buildings that I was against and those that I was for. There were ones that I was for that didn't get built and those that I was against that did get built. So it happens. I mean, that whole thing, and that whole thing raises the whole issue of the cost of education. I mean, people should just understand that you can't just put up buildings on all these campuses without a cost. As you said, that's a $95 million cost went to student fees on top of tuition, on top of everything else. So you can't continue to do that. And just because it's student fees, the legislature often thinks that because it's student fees, it's free money. It's not general purpose revenue. And so the student fees are going up continually, the tuition's going up, and it's very hard for people to maintain in order to, I'm saving money now for my grandkids to go to school.
Well, I was going to, if you were governor or president or God, how would you finance education today? Because I know this goes way back. I mean, property tax relief has been a subject at the Capitol, ever since the income tax was enacted.
Well, when we were there, if you remember back in the 70s and the 80s, property taxes were always the problem with K to 12 education, because regardless of your ability to pay, you paid. And so if you were on a very small fixed income and you happen to live in the family home, which is now worth $200,000, you're paying as much as I am that if I was gainfully employed. That's always been a problem. They tried to fix that in the 80s and the 60s and or in the 90s by going to 2/3. They've now backed off of that. And so you do not have, you have two issues with K to 12 education. One is distribution of the money. And this is my opinion, it's just that too much of the money goes to school districts that can afford it. I mean, we have school districts that only pay $5 a thousand, and they educate their kids at $12,000 or $15,000 a year. You have other school districts that are taxing their people at $20 a thousand, and they can only raise $8,000. And that it goes completely against the whole equalization formulas that Pat Lucy put in place in the 70s, and that's got to be corrected. And then you have to have some kind of control, and I know they don't like to hear that at the local level, but you can't just pump more money into K to 12 and then expect it to equalize itself. Somehow you have to get a control on the cost, and then you have to also get a control. You got to have a funding source, which in the past has always been the income tax. I don't want to go to an Alabama or something who funds most of their schools on sales tax. Higher education is becoming more and more of a private enterprise. I mean, when I was in the legislature in the 70s and the 80s, the state of Wisconsin, through general purpose revenue, funded about 35–40% of education. I think today at Madison it's closer to 12%. And so if you take a look at it, most of their money is coming from student fees, grants, and all sorts of other things, not income tax and sales tax. So the question you want to do is find, from my perspective, and we've talked about it, is the flexibility of the higher education of how they're going to do it.
Chancellor Ward, who's now interim
Yes.
chancellor, second time around, when he was first chancellor, he started very pointedly referring to the UW-Madison as a state-supported school, not a state school, because I think the support had already sunk below 20%.
Yeah.
And yet, you can't raise state taxes. That seems to be an impossibility. What's the solution?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not in the legislature anymore.
If you were running, or if you were governor, do you have any ideas what to do?
For higher education?
For either that or K-12?
Well, for K-12, I think you got to continue to keep a handle on the cost. You got to equalize it, which is probably politically impossible because you can't necessarily take money away from the higher. I mean, we're giving money to school districts that pay a third of what you do or what people do in the city of Madison. I mean, so tax effort is just not, it's not the same around the state.
Didn't Pat Lucy, when he was governor, call for what he called power equalization?
Well,
that you'd actually take money away from the wealthiest districts, their property taxes?
Yes, and I remember when I worked in the Senate for Senator Bill Bablich, he would send me to Green Lake County because they were in the negative aid districts, they used to call them. And so you would have, if you raise so much money from the property tax that you didn't need any state aid, but you raised so much more, you would have to end up paying property tax into a state coffer. It's called negative aids, and I believe the Supreme Court struck that down. And so we had negative aids, and it never was fully implemented, but it would equalize the funding with all the school districts.
Now, politically, I'm surprised that got as far as it did, because of the resistance that would be there from the wealthier districts.
Well, if you take a look at the administration of Pat Lucy, his administration probably did more major things than any other governor since McGovern back in 1911, you know, when they did workers' comp and unemployment comp and all that. I mean, he shared revenue, he revamped it, school aids, he redid that. The whole mental health and in community versus institutionalized. He tried to do corrections, remember, and then that kind of backfired on them because people decided that they don't want to have, you know, community-based things. But
and university merger.
Well, I forgot about university merger, which Lee Dreyfus, again, was a little bit a part of.
So the funding education, now one thing, talking about buildings, is naming rights. Unless you have all student fees to pay for something,
You have some strong feelings on this?
Well,
John?
you got to go out and find naming rights. Of course, on the Madison campus, I guess we should point out the business school. A bunch of alumni got together and gave the School of Business a huge amount of money,
And no rights.
on the on the promise that they would
Yeah.
not name the building for anybody
Yeah.
for 20 years.
Yeah.
But we have all these named buildings. Can you build a building without a major donor to start things off now?
Well, in many cases you can't, which is a problem of, as much as you don't like it though, if someone's going to give you $50 million, you're going to name you're going to name the thing after him if he wants it done. Up at UW Green Bay, if you take a look at their physical it's not their physical education, it's the Princeton Club, or the
Health club?
The health club. The health club at UW Green Bay, if you go through it, you'll see all sorts of naming rights. They have a climbing wall there that's called the Associated Bank climbing wall, and they have all sorts of different naming rights for that. But that's how they had to do it to raise money to keep student fees down. So as much as you may not like it, that's not a bad way to do it. But the problem with that, and we're kind of getting off the subject, but the problem with the legislature especially saying you have to raise 50% of the money for an academic building, forget the FIED or the physical education or the alumni building and all that, but an academic building, UW-Madison has the alumni to maybe raise the $50 million or the $25 million. Superior or UW Stevens Point, if they need a $50 or $100 million building, they can't raise that kind of money. And the legislature or the building commission in the past has kind of gone to the notion that if you raise, the more you raise, the more likely you're going to get ours. Well, that just completely forgets the two. I mean, we have the smaller schools, the comprehensives, I guess we call them, and the UW-Madison, which begs the whole question, is should UW-Madison have a different flexibility and a funding, maybe go out on their own, which they've talked about in the past.
You think they should?
Well, I do not think that the current president of the United States, the current president of the system believes that if you can't do it at UW Superior, you shouldn't allow Madison to do it in the area of flexibility. I think that's nonsense. Madison has the wherewithal to just do different things. You should allow them to do it. For instance, when we did buildings, UW-Madison had all the same staff that I had at state facilities, all the same staff, but they had to run everything through me, and then I'd run it through the building commission rather than just say, you're on your own, you get Board of Regents approval, you can take it to the building commission yourself. You could have saved all sorts of, but the system wouldn't allow that because Superior can't do it. So they didn't want to make Superior mad, so they said they can't do it. And they do that often on the university. They always say, you know, that they're a big system, so if it can't be done at UW Superior, we shouldn't allow Madison to get it done, which is, I think, just illogical.
Isn't there also some tension between the legislature and the university, some distrust of the university on the part of the legislature?
That's my understanding, what I read in the paper. That's
well,
my understanding.
Back in your day.
Oh, there's always been a little mistrust. The university, you know, wants more independence all the time, and I'm one of those that, in many cases, want to give them some more independence. But yeah, there's always a friction. And it used to be much greater and much more warranted because the university used to be used to give them a lot of money. But now as the funding sources go down, the university's raising money other places. And so there's less, I mean, if my figure is correct that Madison gets 12% of its money from the state, then, you know, that control isn't as warranted as it used to be. There's always going to be friction because all you got to do is read the newspapers or listen to the radio or TV, and they'll always say the state and the UW system. Well, you know, as if they're not the state. So, and maybe they shouldn't be the state. I don't know. That's above my.
I keep asking you, if you were governor, what would you propose for either the university or K-12?
Incremental change. Well, K-12, I'm one of those, and well, I don't believe that I'm overtaxed for K-12 education. So I would figure out a good cost control, a good distribution system, and then have enough money to fund that. On the university system, we just got to decide what do we want for a university system. I mean, let's not forget it. 2/3 of the students that graduate from high school in Wisconsin probably will not go to a university system school, won't qualify. At Madison, I think you got to be in the top 25% to get in. So it's getting more and more difficult. You just got to decide what you're going to do.
But we hear the problem that so many students are graduating with huge debt now, which did not happen back in our era,
Yeah.
or not very much. Any solution to that you can see?
No, no. Well, other than I think there's a mindset among young people, and I deal with some of them, is that they just borrow more and more. I mean, I had 3 jobs when I went to college, and maybe we should just warn young people that it is not commonplace to have a $50,000 debt when you're done with getting your Bachelor of Science degree or something.
So it seems to be almost standard procedure.
Well, then they're going to be at a handicap the rest of their lives. I mean, they're going to, whether it's 3.4% or 6.8% on the Stafford loan, they're going to end up spending the rest of their life paying off their bills. So.
You spent a lot of your time in the legislature talking.
And we ought not be in higher educational institutions ought not be encouraging debt, and not so much the university system, but a lot of the different colleges that we have around. You know, you just watch on TV. You know, it's all free, and you got to do. You know, you can go to college free, but you got to get the debt to pay us.
Well, you dealt a lot with education. We've been talking about that a lot, but that was one of the things you dealt with more than some other things in the legislature. But as most legislators who are around for a while, you served on a great variety of committees, talked about a great number of, dealing with a great number of issues. We certainly talked about education. What else sticks in your mind that from that era that people should know about?
Well, one of the toughest issues I dealt with, and one that I'm probably most proud of, is the whole issue of groundwater legislation, protection of our groundwater. I came from a part of the state called the Golden Sands up in Stevens Point, where the leaching of chemicals into the groundwater was very prevalent in the 70s and early 80s. We had very little, if any, legislation dealing with that. And so, you know, sometimes I was opposed by my own constituency, and other times supported by my own constituency, but we put together, it was Mary Lou Muntz, Joe Stroll at that time, Senator Joe Stroll, myself and others, we put together a committee, and we came up with groundwater, a process, not only standards, but a process that we use, a 3-tiered process that is used now nationally. And I'm very proud of that. It was the first time that we actually had groundwater legislation like that. So I was very proud of that. There's other issues, education was my big issue. Environmental education became, at UW-Stevens Point we have the College of Natural Resources, so I became very sensitive to the whole issue of environmental education. And I've always felt that unless you teach and ingrain environmental education into people in the curriculum, you're never going to get a handle on it. So we passed legislation called environmental. What we did was we mandated, which was not always liked, that you would incorporate environmental education into the current curriculum, whether it be math or other things. So if you go into grade schools today, you'll see where they'll use, in the math class, they'll be using environmental issues, and they ingrain that in there. And that's one of the standards that we put into the statutes years ago. And then we also started the Environmental Center up in Stevens Point, which was has a lot to do with the College of Natural Resources. I was very lucky when I was in the Senate that I represented not only UW-Stevens Point and the College of Natural Resources and the other colleges, but College of Natural Resources, but I also represented the Marshfield Clinic in Marshfield. And so I used to always have you know, I was never short of people to call upon for advice on those kind of issues. So very lucky.
Do we mandate the schools to do too much?
Well, it depends. Put it this way. I used to always tell people that, you know, mandates aren't great, but if you have a school district in rural Wisconsin someplace that isn't doing their job in educating their kids, it's a state responsibility to take care of it. So quite frankly, mandates aren't for a Madison school system. Mandates are usually for school systems that without the mandates, they wouldn't get it done. I don't think that because you have a local school system and you're locally elected, you have a right to deprive children of certain things. And so I think state mandates, I mean, you can argue about what those state mandates are, but mandates, I think, are completely legitimate. I think education is a state responsibility.
I guess some of those small districts will say, well, we don't have the money to do it. You're mandating us to do something and not giving us the money. And
that could be true, too. Then you should fund it, I guess. Yeah.
Education, on joint finance, health care, and property tax relief. That's the perennial. It's about 100 years old now, before the legislature, ever since the income tax was enacted in, what, 1912?
Yeah.
With the promise that the proceeds would be used to relieve property taxes.
By Governor McGovern.
And the debate has continued ever since.
Yeah, and it will
You've
continue.
seen sections of it.
Yeah.
Where is it going? What's going to happen?
Well, you know, I've often thought, and I don't have an answer to this, but one of the problems that we have in Wisconsin is that those who raise the money don't spend it. And so if you take a look at the state budget, you know, get rid of Medicaid and university system, most of the other money goes to local governments. And so you take a look at a county board member, I don't know what the figures are today, but when I was there, you take a look at a county board member used to raise probably 10%, maybe 15% from the property tax of what they were responsibility for spending. And so they would get the shared revenue and all these other aids. School districts are the same way. School systems, probably of the total school budget, I don't know what the figure is today, but of a total school budget, a school board only has responsibility for raising probably 20%, maybe 30% of that. So the legislature is raising it and school boards are spending it, and you have this constant conflict between the two. I proposed once that we should have school board elections run the same time as you do assembly and state senate elections, because the whole issue of how you're going to raise school taxes and spend it is a joint effort between those two, and they should be running together on those issues. I don't have an answer for that, but that's one of the problems. I mean, if you take a look at Wisconsin, again, I don't know what the figures are today, but if you take a look at Wisconsin, in the past, when you take a look at state government employees, state government, you know, running the state government, we were like 48th out of 50 states. But when it came to local units of government, and this may change now for what's happened recently, but if you take a look at total spending by local governments, we were pretty close to the top. And so we have a small state government, we give a lot of the money back, so you have this disconnect between these people. And if you're a legislator and you have 89 townships in your district, it's hard to tell them no to something. So.
Yeah, we have, I don't know how many thousands of local units of government, not only the counties and the cities and the villages and the towns, but sewage districts and...
Probably 2,500 to 3,000.
Almost all legislators give lip service to the idea of local control, that local officials are best, but of course we can both cite many examples where the legislature decided no, did the opposite. But is that generally a good
Well, I
idea?
always thought, when I was in the legislature, I always felt I had a responsibility for K-12 education. And I know we over-mandated at times, and then we should work on those. But the responsibility, I still think, I think it's in the Constitution that we fund, you know, that we take care of K-12 education.
The state constitution guarantees a free public education to all students that shall be as equitable, I believe is the word,
Possible.
as possible.
Right.
And of course, defining that word equitable,
Yeah.
whether, as we were talking before, some school districts have the wherewithal to spend much more than others. What is as equitable as possible?
Yeah.
Would you define it? The legislature has attempted to
Well,
define it.
I've
the
only
Supreme
defined,
Court.
there's two ways to define it, and we've always tried to define it by money. You know, I don't know the figures again today, but you know, that we should make sure that there's X amount, that the property tax effort is equal across the state, and that we put money into, that the property tax is equal across the state, and that we put equal, that each student would have equal amount of money behind them. The other way is to talk about the curriculum. I mean, just say, we'll fund the basic curriculum for everybody, and if you want to have 6 language courses, then you pay for the last 4. Don't know.
So after years in the legislature, you went to the private sector. Tell us about that. Why and how did you like that?
Well, I spent 18 years in the legislature. I thought the life expectancy of a state senator is not much longer than 18 years, so I needed a change for a variety of reasons, and I tried it and went to Alliant Energy. They were very good to me, and I retired from there in 2007.
The money was better, I assume.
Oh yeah, the money. Well, when I was in the legislature, I started in the legislature in you never, I don't know what it is today, but you didn't really run for the legislature for the money. When I first ran in 1978, I think the salary was $19,000, and when I left, I think I was making $33,000 or $34,000 after 18 years. So, no, I had a son in college and things, so the money was fine too, but that wasn't the main reason I left.
What was the reason?
Well, being in the minority, being in the legislature, there was just, I had served my time. There was a time to leave, I was 46 years old, and at the time I said, if I was going to start something new, I needed to do it then. And I didn't want to make a career out of the legislature itself, and at 46, you're darn close to making it a career. So, and I think I was getting a little frustrated with myself and with what was going on, and I think that would have just played out in what I did. So it was good to change. In hindsight, nowadays the young people nowadays, they're having 7 careers between the time that they start and when they leave, and that's probably good for a person's soul, I think.
What surprises did you have, or what did you learn when you went to the private sector? Any particular surprise or things you learned?
Well, I mean, this may sound silly to a lot of people, but it was a little more rigid. I mean, when you're in the legislature, especially when I was majority leader, I kind of set my hours. In the legislature, someone else does that or when you're in the private sector, well, not just the private sector, but most other jobs other than legislators, you have to kind of, be there every day and things, which was fine with me. I liked, the private sector does reward you in many ways, not just financially, when you do a good job, and that was, I found that was very healthy. I find in state government, we don't always reward people because of different systems that we have. I always had the flexibility when I had people that worked for me that did things, I could reward them. That wasn't true in the legislature. Well, probably in most state government jobs.
So then you, after time there, you decided to come back to the state government. Why was
well,
that?
I decided to decided to retire. In 2007, I decided to retire. I just thought retirement, it was the right time to retire for a variety of reasons, and I was prepared to do it, so I retired. I often tell people now that my wife told me I couldn't stay home unsupervised, and so when the opportunity as Secretary of the Building Commission and Division of State Facilities came up, I took that. I have a great deal of respect for state government in the work that it does, and I found that was true there. I had 80 architects and engineers working for me, as well as people that cleaned the floors, and I just respected them all. It was a great job, great job.
What did you learn in the legislature? Looking back on it, what are you most proud of?
Most proud of in the way of issues, or in the...
Yeah, well, either back in the
well,
legislature.
I often talk about the environmental education, I talk about groundwater, but there are little things. I mean, one of the things I really liked about the legislature, and this sounds corny, and I think this is true of others that I dealt with, are the things you could do for people. One of the very first pieces of legislation I ever passed is we had a gentleman, just died recently up in Stevens Point. He was handicapped and he couldn't drive a car. He couldn't get a driver's license. And he had this 3-wheel bike. And the 3-wheel bike, some friends of his put a little motor on it. So that, and nowadays you can buy them, but at those days you couldn't. And he had a little motor on it, so when he lived 3 miles out of town, he'd work at Century, doing odds and ends. And the people at Century, I think, helped him build this bike at Century Insurance in Stevens Point. And they built this bike, and he could go on the road with it, just that little distance. Well, he got stopped, he couldn't, and whatever. So I passed legislation, it took 6 months to a year. We passed legislation that you can get a separate license for those kind of bikes, and that's still in place today. Those kind of little things really meant a lot to me because it took care of people that I knew back home, and people that really had problems. So I really enjoyed those. Those are some of the highlights of what I did. I mean, the other highlight is just the number of opportunities. And when I look at my time in the legislature, it gave me the opportunity of doing things that I never would have been able to meet people that I never would have been able to meet before. Affect legislation. I mean, I've had the opportunity to work with Pat Lucy, Martin Schreiber, Tony Earl, who I respect a great deal, Tommy Thompson, who I respect as a Republican a great deal, and him and I got along fine. We were, and Governor Doyle. I had the opportunity of working with them on all sorts of different things, and I've been on committees and everything. That's been a great, that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't run for the legislature, probably.
Constituent service is something that you don't see in the newspaper stories. That's not the side of legislating that people aren't real aware of, but that's real important.
Well, it was not only important, I mean, it was important because that was your job, but for me it was kind of a, you know, maybe, I mean, I look at Bill Clinton and I look at Hillary Clinton, and you can just, and I've been with them at different times, that, you know, not in bigger rooms, they kind of feed on people. When they get people, they kind of get, they love it, you know. And I'm kind of the same way. I mean, and so constituent relations were actually fun for me. I enjoyed those a great deal. And there were, a lot of legislators don't do that today because they're afraid of the extremes coming to their meetings. So they don't, I used to hold 30, 40 office hours a year in my little Senate district. I don't think they do as many today because they're afraid they're going to get picketed and all those other things.
Was campaigning fun? Would it be today?
Campaigning the first time and then for the Senate was fun. Today, I think it would be just, I would not be able to handle it. When I resigned from the legislature, one of the reasons was my frustration, and one of the frustrations was just the sheer amount of money. When I was majority leader, I had to help raise money, and the sheer amount of money you had to raise for it, and today it's 10 times worse. And the negative things, I mean, I used to stay up at night in 1978 and 1980 because my opponent had that day accused me of not working hard or something, and I took that personally. Today, the things that candidates put up with, I just don't understand how they do it and keep their head up at night. They just get beat up from all angles. If you take a look, you know, I'm on all these different blogs, and you take a look at all of this unsubstantiated stuff about even the candidates I don't like. I don't know how candidates do that. I could never run for the Assembly today or the Senate. Serving I'd probably enjoy that, but I couldn't do it. One, I wouldn't want to raise the money. Two, I wouldn't want to go under the scrutiny. You know, not because I had anything to hide, but I just couldn't take the extremes of both political parties today.
So
that's not me. I mean,
yeah, I've heard many
if
times.
I ran, I'd run from the middle, and I don't know if there is one anymore.
Yeah. Well, Rick, I hear from all politicians that recruiting candidates to run is so difficult because of the probability that they'll face that sort of attack and the money raising.
Yeah. If you take a look at advertising, and I did some of this at Alliant, you know, if you take a look at advertising, take Coke and Pepsi, you know. You don't see Coke and Pepsi really going at it tooth and nail. They'll say, I taste better, and those kind of things.
Now, Coke doesn't say Pepsi is communist.
No. And so, and why don't they do that? The reason they don't do it is that they don't want their marketplace to be tainted. But in the legislature, not in Congress or in legislative bodies, you have candidates now bringing the institution down to the point where, just like if you said, you know, if you were saying Coke has got arsenic and all that other kind, well, people would stop buying Pepsi as well as Coke. Well, today, it's harder to find good candidates. And when you find candidates, they're candidates with extremes that have very simplistic ideas about how things are done. You can have all the criticism you want of people running out of college, running or working for government and then running in government, which I did. You can have all the criticism you want of them, but at least they understood that solving problems weren't easy. And today they seem to think that they're easy.
Or some people today don't see much of a role for government. We have people running, well, that's the charge that people running government don't like government.
Well, that's the difference, I think, between when And I hate to compare what we did. I mean, it's like, you know, telling my kids that I walked to school uphill and all those kind of things. But if you take a look at the people that ran for office, most of them, whether they're Democrat or Republican, wanted to see government work. I mean, Tommy Thompson wanted to see government work. Lee Dreyfus wanted to see government work. They had different ideas, but they wanted to see government work. Walter John Chilson wanted to see government work. The Tim Cullens and the Bill Bablages wanted to see government work. They differed on it, they fought, and then they would resolve the issues. Today, you have people that don't want government to work. And in many cases, their strategy is to dry up enough revenue sources that you shrink government. I mean, it's, you know, taxes today are the lowest they've been in, what, 30, 40, 50 years, but you still want them lower. Many people want them lower, not because it's good for your pocketbook, which is probably good, but they want to do it because they want to starve the monster, which is government. That's different than the way it used to be. I mean, people used to come to government to try to make it work.
Any idea how to turn that around and get back to?
I don't know. I mean, I look at government, I mean, we ran in such simplistic times, you know. I would buy the front page of the Shopper. The local radio station would interview me. We'd have 3, 4, 5 debates. The local newspaper would interview us and have an editorial. You'd meet people. You'd be forced to go meet people, and that was it. Well, today, with the internet, just remember, you have a majority of the people in this country today rely upon the likes of Keith Olbermann and Rush Limbaugh for their news. I mean, that's where they get their news. And just think about that. I mean, they don't read the newspapers. They don't find it out. They get it from people that aren't really reporters. And when you do that, then it corrupts the whole process. I don't know how you do it. If my kids were to ask me, should they run for office today, I don't know if I'd tell them to go ahead and do it.
They say back in our day, the most trusted man on television was Walter Cronkite.
Well, in my district, in my area, it was Walter John Chilson.
Yeah, he was the local TV
he was my
anchor.
Walter Cronkite.
But now I guess it's Jon Stewart.
Jon Stewart.
Completely different atmosphere.
Yeah, but at least with Jon Stewart, you know, it's a joke, you know, you know, when they listen to these, I won't, I'll offend everybody, but it's people on both sides. They get their news from the wrong place.
That's a standard question that I've asked people. What advice would you give to a young person today who might want to make a difference?
Well, first of all, to be very maybe the same thing I used to say when I was 19 years old, marching in of Vietnam protests. You know, I would say don't trust anybody over 35. You know, I tell my grandkid, my 12-and-a-half-year-old, you know, just you read, and do not take anything for face value. You find it out because somebody on TV said that John Wilkes Booth was not the real killer of Abraham Lincoln. Don't just take it on face value. Try to find out and read more about it. And that's what people have to do. That goes back to education and everything else. I don't know. I mean, people are so turned off by politics today that I don't think they want to read it. And I find, now that I'm retired, I watch a lot less news and a lot more ESPN. And I'm serious, and I do it. I used to, and I just do that. And I think the public's the same way. I mean, my kids, who are both politically active, they don't want to watch most of that stuff anymore.
You said you got into things to make a difference.
You know,
if your 12-year-old or some other young person comes to you today and says, I want to make a difference, you might not be advising them to run for office then.
Yeah, if I was candid with them, I would say, I would try to point out to them the problems that, you know, and people have asked me, and I've told them, you know, just remember, you're going to do this, you're going to be called an SOB, you're going to be accused of this and accused of that, and some blogger in Milwaukee's going to say this, and within 24 hours, people are going to be emailing it to other people that it's the truth because he said it. You just got to be aware of all of that. You know, I often think, I just went to Washington, D.C. with my grandson and took him there. He's 12 and a half years old. And we went to a play at Ford's Theater. It's called 1776, and it's a play about the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. And it was a little comedy, a little musical, good play, great play. I'd recommend it to people. 1776. And it was Thomas Jefferson and Adams and Ben Franklin and all of that. And they did a nice job. And it was about the drafting of the Declaration. And they got to the point where they told Thomas Jefferson to draft something. And they all told him what they wanted drafted. He drafted it. And they then spent 2 weeks debating that. And Jefferson had 86 different concessions that he had to make on the draft. 86. Basically 86 amendments to the Declaration of Independence. Today, we would not have a Declaration of Independence because they couldn't agree on 85 changes and have unanimous support. That's what they did, because they wanted unanimous support, and they were one short, but they wanted unanimous support. You couldn't do that today, and I don't know if I want to recommend a lot of people getting into that process.
Do you think you made a difference?
I think I made a difference. I think I made a difference in some people's lives. I think I made a difference in both by legislation as well as helping people. I think I did. And I'm very proud of what we did in the legislature. I'm not as proud today as say, you know, it's kind of philosophical, but I'm not as proud today to say that I was a legislator as I was then.
Well, what is the reaction if people don't know that? You say, I was in the legislature.
I told, well, you know, if you're out of state, and we travel a lot, and people ask you what you did, I always talk about my private sector experience. If we get into the legislative part, they all go, you know, and you get a lot of that. And I hear that from my other colleagues, too, or my other former colleagues. You know, we used to have reunions all the time. We had one over here a while back, but we used to have smaller reunions. We just don't do that anymore. We used to have our little Senate Athletic Club T-shirts. We don't wear those in public too much anymore.
I remember the days when we had the legislature versus reporters baseball game at the biennial budget spring picnic.
Right.
Well, now there aren't enough reporters to field a baseball team, I don't think.
Well, which is one of the problems. I mean, if you take a look at it, when I was there, we used to have a statewide newspaper. You know, it was the Milwaukee Journal or the Milwaukee Sentinel. They covered the state. They had 3 reporters there.
At the Capitol, yes.
Journal had 3, the Sentinel had 3. You had at least 2 or 3 from the Fox Valley with Wingard and those people, John Wingard. Today,
AP and UPI, which is long gone.
Yeah. Now you don't have that kind of coverage of what's going on in the state capitol. The TV coverage is skimpy, and when they do it, it's kind of just they feed them, you know, and there's not a lot of in-depth reporting, and it's usually on scandalous things, and then they kind of blow it out of proportion. So you have that whole problem. You have the problem of, you know, everybody's attention span is small, so they listen to people they like, people that they agree with. So if you're on the right, you listen to Rush Limbaugh, and you say, Rush said, and that must be true. And if you're on the left, you listen to Ed Schultz, or I guess Oberman's now been fired again. Maybe you go back to ESPN. And so you get, you know, Ed Schultz, where'd you hear that? Ed Schultz. Well, you know, Rush Limbaugh. You just don't, and people, you know, I've been in places where I've been seen reading the New York Times, and somebody that I'll know say, you read that rag? So things are different.
I'd like to end this on a more optimistic note.
You know, you just look at the people that I could look up to when I was young. I mean, when I was in the legislature. I mean, I was part of the Obie Nelson group of northern Wisconsin. So I had Gaylord Nelson and Dave Obie to look up to. I had, the Republican side, I had Mel Laird to look up to. I don't know if you have that today, you know.
I was looking for a more optimistic way to end this. Do you have any words of optimism for the future?
Well, this too will change. I mean, things change. I think things will change, and hopefully people will. People are involved. I mean, the good thing is people are involved in politics today. I mean, more so than ever before. So hopefully things will change. And the one change I want to see is just that there's a majority of people at some point want government to work. I mean, whatever that means and whatever it is. And, you know, as a retiree, does that mean I have to give up something in order to get what I want over here and others do that? but it's a give and take, and hopefully that we'll get back to that. I mean, we did it when we did the Declaration of Independence. Maybe we could do it, get back to that point again.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you
It's
for
been
having
very
me.
interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Feel better already.
Good.